Hi, everybody. So if you don't know me, my name's Oscar. This year, I'm one of the conveners of the Queer Action Collective. And today, along with one of my most wonderful friends, Tia, we're going to be delving a little bit into the biopolitics of sex. Um, the inspiration for this is basically my feeling that within the left and within society more broadly, the culture war over whether gender is a distinct entity from sex that exists is significantly well advanced. It'd be remiss for me to suggest that that concept is totally normalized within society, or it's totally one that I think everyone understands. It's certainly not, but I think there's a disparity between that notion and the notions of sex, for instance, not being a binary. I think intelligent and savvy transphobes and intersex phobes have latched themselves to the appeal that biology is ultimately more important than gender, but also that it is a binary that exists before all discussion of things like gender. I think both of these are untrue. Neither of them are facts, and sex is just as unstable a concept of a binary as is the gender binary. Biology is not the ally of TERFs and queerphobes. So today we wanted to delve a little bit deeply into why that's exactly the case. I guess another inspiration for this talk was given last year by, it was called Money and Finance in the Left, which keen observers will note is a different topic to this. But it was given by our very own lame duck president, Swapnik. I loved the idea of turning ordinary things that we might have been taught in a class and not have really been taught to apply to a political context, and then sharing them in this sort of radical education format. And so I thought I had something to share about sex being a binary. And so I pitched it. We've also, both of us have lamented that, a lot of people don't really understand, including people who are trans, who first realizing that they're trans, that trans healthcare isn't very well understood. And we wanted to talk about what it actually looks like in Australia, what options exist, and to delve deeply into that. Ultimately, we hope that us being very, very queer and very, very not cis, and having degrees in medical science will come of some utility to the left. So that's our mission statement. Let's get onto an overview of what we're going to talk about. Okay, so I think I've sort of presaged this. The first part of the talk is going to be just a deep dive from me about why human biological sex is not a binary. The second part will be talking about transgender health basics in the Australian system. And the third part will be talking about how we can apply this and learn things as left-wing people. I will give a content warning at the beginning of this talk. A central aim of it will be detailed refutation of transphobia and intersex phobia and engaging with that kind of rhetoric and language. As a consequence, the ideas that we develop in this talk are quite candid and head-on with respect to those. It's ultimately our belief that it is vital to arm left-wing people, queer or ally, with knowledge and language required to defeat transphobic rot where it lies. However, we also acknowledge that, this can be distressing for people. So we give it candidly and with the acknowledgement that people can make their own informed choices about what they wish to hear about. So before we get into the actual meat of the discussion, I will give a brief introduction to me and Tia. So I've sort of said this before. We're both very not cis, and we're also people who have medical science and physiology training, specifically about reproductive biology. We're also queer rights activists organized within the Queer Action Collective, which is a cool collective that people should get involved in. Okay, let's get into the actual detail. Erroneous transphobe claim number 1. Sex is a male and female binary. I think this claim is totally baseless, and I want to establish why that is. Okay, let's start with the first theory of why people think that sex is a binary, which is, maybe on the evaluation of claims, the strongest one. The theory is it's all just in the chromosomes, and that chromosomes are the thing that defines sex. I think a lot of people are familiar with sort of like a year 9 or year 10 biology level understanding of what chromosomes are, but basically XX and XY are what people typically are invoking when they're talking about chromosomes. So XX being people that would be traditionally considered biologically female, and XY being biologically male. And so the assertion then from people who feel that sex is a binary is that these chromosomes determine who you are above anything else, and so sex must then be a very important binary. Unfortunately, there are lots of groups of people whose existence flies against this concept. So the first group that I wanted to discuss is people who are neither XX or XY. The term for this is aneuploidy, and it can take a lot of forms. So for instance, there are people who have only an X chromosome and nothing else. There are people who have 3 X chromosomes and 1 Y. There are, lots of different orientations of chromosomes that transcend that binary. But I think a lot of people would be unconvinced by that claim, or would say simply in response, which I've put here, that it's not simply just about the variations in chromosomes. It's really about the presence or an absence of a Y chromosome. So that's an attempt to return the fact that there are people with lots and different kinds of sex chromosomes to a binary. So either you have a Y chromosome or you don't. And the basis for that claim would be that the Y chromosome has genes on it that are quite significant when it comes to things like development of organs and whatever. But actually, it's not quite that simple. There are 2 groups of people that I think are of interest, and I think this is really cool, who fly in the face of that notion, basically. The first group of people are people who have an X and a Y chromosome. So if you were to use the logic of XY means you're male, who ultimately live their entire life from birth as cisgender women. The reason that this happens is that essentially development happens differently of sex organs. So where usually the Y chromosome might cause you to grow a penis, and for the gonads, which are just, I guess, in fetuses, they're just balls of stem cells, where they might descend into becoming testicles. They don't, and they become ovaries. And so these people become essentially cisgender women, but they have XY chromosomes. So it's clear to me that chromosomes are, at the very least, not destiny, and certainly not a binary. The second group of people that I think are of interest is XY people who are like the second group and are raised as cisgender women until puberty. And there is a specific reason for this. But after puberty, they ultimately, they have organs that would get them labeled by institutional medicine as females. And then after puberty, they actually grow a penis, and they experience like a male puberty. This is due to an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase 2, which may not be of very much interest to you, but that's, if you're interested in researching that further, that's an entirely different category of people who are XY, grow up as cis women, and then eventually have organs and a male puberty. So really what I'm trying to establish with this slide is that chromosomes are really not what people think they are, and they're not so determinative. So I've also put here Sarah Kelly Keenan, who is the first American who uses she, her pronouns to be legally recognized as intersex. And she is one of the people in this category. Great. Let's move on to the second theory, which is it's all just hormones. So I think the natural response when you explain to people that actually chromosomes aren't just XX and XY, they aren't just determinative totally of who you become and what organs and how you seem to the world. Then they say, oh, well, actually, then it's just all hormones. Like, really the variations between sexes are just hormones. Males have testosterone and females have estrogen and progesterone. Unfortunately, it's still not that simple. So a lot of people in first year, I don't know if people can see this, but it is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which is a very common first year reading that a lot of people have. And obviously I don't endorse every single idea that is contained within that book. But there is this interesting chapter that talks about how postmenopausal women are really just a third sex, which certainly would have to be a conclusion of it's all just hormones, because the thing that props up, cisgender endosex females having periods, as it were, is like the presence of ovarian eggs in the ovary. When that ceases to happen, the hormonal responses drastically change and cause all of the organ structures to completely change. And that leads to all kinds of effects that flow on from it. One of them is an increased risk of, for instance, osteoporosis. And those drastically change. So they're totally different from someone's earlier years to their later years. And if you were really using the definition that hormonal profiles define who you are as a person and what sex that you have, you would have basically no choice in that definition to define menopausal females as different, which I don't think is a political claim a lot of people are really willing to make. The second, I guess, response to the hormones are sex theory is that there are a bunch of people who resist that definition. So there are people who have two X chromosomes and are, for all intents and purposes, cisgender women, who have something called hyperandrogenism, which means that you have naturally high testosterone levels. And depending on other hormonal profile responses later down the pathway, that can have various effects on who you are as a person in terms of like what the effects of testosterone are. But it's totally separate from your hormones. It's totally separate from your chromosomes. And it's totally different for how you identify with your own sex. So clearly hormones are really not even satisfying very much for that theory either. The third thing that I've included here is hormones mean nothing if they don't bind to something, which if people have ever done like a physiology unit, they really grind this into you, that hormone, you can have massive levels of hormones in your bloodstream and they can mean nothing if the receptor isn't signaling in the way that it usually does. And that is behind a lot of the differences in how people respond to hormones, is the actual receptor response rather than how much you have. So that's the basis of hormones. Then I think the final theory that you get left with on the pursuit to square the circle that that sex is a binary is the idea that, okay, throw away chromosomes, throw away hormones, they don't work for us. there are surely some organs or some traits that define what biological sex that you are. And I think obviously a lot of people would be able to recognize this claim as quite clearly transphobic, for the simple reason that people's organs and traits don't typically define them in any other way. And it's quite obviously a claim that is made by transphobes. So unfortunately, I keep saying unfortunately, even though it's quite fortunate that these things are wrong, this also doesn't really work. So there are lots of categories of people that fly in the face of this. So the first that I am interested in talking about is cisgender men, who have something called gynecomastia, which is essentially growing mammary tissue of various size. It is an entirely normal part of a male puberty to grow like mammary tissue, which would usually, you would think, define you as female. And then there is also a group of people, perhaps less intuitively, who live as cisgender women but have prostates. So if we were to go back to this slide, both of these categories of people would live as women but have prostates. So clearly organs don't necessarily fix the problems of definition for people who think sex is a binary. I think, in order to categorize, you need to have clusters of organs that match together. So you need to have prostates and penises together, and you need to have, uteruses and ovaries together. But there are lots of people who have clusters of organs that don't necessarily match in this set of definitions. People who have prostates and a vagina at the same time, or people who have a penis but also have a uterus. All those kinds of things fly in the face of defining people's sex on the basis of what clusters of organs they have. More obviously, it appears to me somewhat obvious that you can change your sex organs, so not a very stable basis for a binary. And indeed, people's sex organs change regularly throughout life. So it doesn't seem as if that's stable either. I also think it quite clearly intersects with earlier problems that we had in this talk with defining things on hormones and chromosomes, because hormones and chromosomes are often quite upstream of what organs and traits that you ultimately end up having. If those things aren't stable and those things can't be created into a binary, it's very difficult for organs and traits then to match them. So I think that more or less debunks any concept that sex is a binary. And I hope that's useful information to people. Before I move on from this part of the talk, I want to meaningfully engage with some legitimate criticisms of the approach that I've taken in this part of the talk. The first is that it's too focused on exceptions. So a claim that I've heard when these ideas have been raised is that sex is actually just bimodal, but it has a series of exceptions that sort of make it a spectrum, but those exceptions aren't important. Unfortunately, the term exception really doesn't work because there are too many to be exceptions, and it is inherently subjective what you define as an exception. Most critically, though, I think it runs into a problem that saying that sex is a binary is a universalizing claim. So it says that everybody can be characterized as male or female and has a set of traits. But if there are exceptions or are significant, you can plot it as a spectrum, then that universalizing language doesn't work. So it doesn't particularly matter how common the exceptions are, although many are quite common. It's universalizing language. So if it's not two discrete categories, your rhetoric falls apart. The second thing that I particularly wanted to address is that a lot of this discussion medicalizes intersex life unnecessarily and becomes a little bit unhelpful. I tend to agree with this criticism, and as best as possible when I've been delivering this information, I've tried to siphon away the kinds of language that institutional medicine uses. So a lot of the people that I've, like, categories of people that I've spoken about in this talk, you might find those defined as syndromes or deficiencies of something. And I don't think that language is particularly helpful, if only for the reason that it is not a disease, that it is just the variation in sex that is usual to biological creatures. And so I don't think it's very helpful as for intersex people for this kind of language to be used. Obviously it helps us to explain why people who are endosex, so who have the experiences of cisgender females or cisgender males, why their notions of sex aren't true. But it is absolutely not an excuse to medicalize and other them. So I think that's a very important thing to establish. The third criticism of this approach is perhaps the most sort of radical feminist critique of the approach. And I think it's maybe one that Simone would have made in the 1949. It is that the notion of sex is not politically useful, that it's been the basis of important organizing, and that destabilizing that organizing is unhelpful. I don't have very much time for this claim. Pointing out that people are gay has never harmed political movements of underprivileged heterosexuals. And we're able to claim that perspective because we've seen it play out. What this is it's nakedly a turf talking point that is masquerading as a political concern. It's not a serious concern. Obviously, you can destabilize a binary without everybody who is a party to that binary like escaping from how they see themselves. So you obviously can accept that sex isn't binary, but also live your life as someone who identifies with being biologically male and is cisgender. It's really not that difficult. So I don't think this criticism is particularly serious either. I think that it's intellectually rigorous to engage with criticisms, but I don't really think any of them are so serious as to question the entire approach, basically. So I hope overall that was interesting to some people, or that was information you have never heard, because I think specifics are often very, very useful to actually debunking language meaningfully. So that's my part of the talk. I have time for some discussions and questions, but might need to make it a little bit quick. Okay, I'm gonna wait maybe 15 more seconds. Okay. Don't seem to be any questions. If you have any about this part of the talk, you can ask them later. Now for Tia's part of the talk.
Hi guys. So essentially the purpose of my section of the talk is just to inform you about some key points of trans healthcare, specifically to Australia. Obviously, the kind of regulations around this vary between jurisdictions, between countries, and even between states. But generally, it's quite homogenous within Australia, at least. This is coming from my own experience of seeking medical treatment for gender dysphoria, or at least seeking to commence hormone replacement therapy. I'm not a medical professional. I do not have a medical degree. I'm not a healthcare professional of any kind. So if you do have any serious health concerns about hormones or any other therapies or surgeries that you may or may not be seeking, of course, ask your doctor. So this information is based on my own research. I try my best to use peer-reviewed sources, and my own skills that I gained through studying medical science to at least, be critical. So this is my best job that I could do. Anyway, move to the next slide, please. Okay, so essentially in Australia, the biggest issue that we have facing us at the moment is that there aren't actually any standards of care that are enforced nationwide. It's basically an opt-in system where it's on the part of the doctor to seek out this information and educate themselves. It's in no way a requirement. Many doctors who you will approach will be unwilling to work with you because of their lack of experience with trans healthcare. They may refer you to other doctors. If they know some who are willing to work with you, it's very common to be turned away or to be dismissed in that regard. There's also no medical training around transgender healthcare, or it's severely lacking in medical school and beyond. And while most of the drugs that people take are covered by the PBS, many gender affirming surgeries are not, and these can be prohibitively expensive. And many people will go overseas, which in some cases works out perfectly fine, but poses risks because of different regulations and also the issue of seeking post-surgical care from the original surgeon who performed the procedure. There's also, and this is a point that I'm particularly interested in for my PhD, the health disparities between transgender people and the general population. In 2016, there was a nationwide LGBT health survey that was conducted, and it was very helpful. However, we know that transgender people are particularly affected by issues such as drug and alcohol addiction and have much poorer health outcomes than their other LGBT peers. So it's important that we do further research to sort of separate out this group and understand how they're uniquely impacted by these issues. And currently there's not a lot of understanding and there's a paucity of research in this area. The overall kind of governing body that doctors can kind of apply to become a part of is OzPath. And usually the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners do put out statements for the administration of hormones and referrals for surgery. They aren't, uniquely specialized in this area, of course, but it's usually because primary care physicians are heavily involved in one particular pathway of trans care. The other one is the Royal Australian College of Psychiatrists, which I don't really like very much, but I'll get to that later. Next slide, please, Oscar. So one particular pathway, and this is the pathway that I personally ended up going down, is the informed consent model. This is actually supported by the kind of global trans healthcare body. And essentially, it gives you the ability to access hormone replacement therapy with less barriers. And this has a few really important benefits. It improves access for people in rural and remote areas who obviously have a more difficult time accessing healthcare in any respect. It's also a good harm reduction method because often if people are unable to get hormones the usual way or the traditional way, they will order hormones online and have them delivered, and they may be from overseas. It's an unregulated source of hormones. And while the drugs may be quite the same, without close kind of medical supervision, it can actually pose quite a lot of risks. So by increasing the access to these hormones, we can actually protect trans people by ensuring that they're doing it safely. It's of course limited to adults, so anyone who's the age of majority in a region usually, so 18 plus for Australia. And generally you seek help from a GP who kind of openly subscribes to this model. Usually they will advertise themselves on websites such as TransHub, which is a website that was established in 2020 at some point, I believe. And so that's an easy way for you to find general practitioners or other physicians who prescribe hormones this way. And usually that GP or physician will remain your primary treating physician, and you will have a relationship with them for the duration of your treatment, however long that lasts. Typically, it's a lifelong sort of thing. Yeah, next slide, please. And so the reason I want to talk about WPATH, and WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And there's a lot of controversy with this particular organization. They've been around for decades, and they've gone by many different names. They're typically sort of criticized for being transmedicalist, and transmedicalist, as the name suggests, is the medicalization of transness. And usually this comes under the idea that, gender dysphoria is labeled as a mental condition or some kind of pathology, rather than, just another manifestation of the natural diversity of humankind. And so they kind of are, usually accused of being gatekeepers, which I believe is true to some extent. And I kind of agree with that point, but I won't go into it too much. Essentially, they set out these standards of care that have a lot of influence worldwide on the standards of care within different countries. And the only real difference between their standards of care and the informed consent model is that they typically require quite a rigorous psychosocial assessment, which just means essentially you're meeting with a qualified mental health professional who is trying to establish and diagnose gender dysphoria. And it's also limited to adults in this particular way. For children, it's completely different, but I'll discuss that a bit later. And typically, they also stipulate that any mental health concerns must be reasonably well controlled, although they do, at least in recent versions, in version 7, there's a new version coming out in December 2021, which I'm very much looking forward to, where they kind of concede that even if a mental health condition isn't reasonably well controlled, it may be appropriate to continue treatment and treat a mental health condition concurrently. But yeah, there's a lot of controversy about this. A few very influential sort of physicians that are a part of this organization have come forward and given statements in an interview to Abigail Schreier, who is just a notoriously transphobic author from America, and caused quite a stir there. But yeah, generally not relevant. The Australian kind of standards of care set by OzPath are probably more relevant to you guys. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I just want to go through the different types of hormone therapy. There's two main ones. There's masculinizing and feminizing. So masculinizing hormones involves the injection of or administration of testosterone. There are many different ways to administer it, intramuscular or subcutaneous injection. You can take it through pills. You can apply it as a gel or as a patch to your skin. Typically used for transmasculine individuals who want to gain more typically masculine secondary sex characteristics. And this table was taken from the WPATH standards of care, the version 7, most recent. And they essentially outline some of the primary effects and the onset and the typical period within which you can expect to see the maximum effect. And these are usually supported by quite rigorous evidence, sometimes more anecdotal. And a lot of the time, and I really want to stress this, I think it's really important as a trans person who's seeking to start hormones or undergo surgery. It's unfortunate that you need to be this way, but it's really important that you take control of your healthcare and you really try and educate yourself on the potential health risks. Now, these are generally safe. Both masculinizing and feminizing hormone therapy are considered quite safe, although there's very little evidence about the long-term risks, purely as a result of the fact that many trans people have only been on these treatments for so long, and oftentimes, because it's such a small population, it's difficult to kind of keep track of people and like to generate enough reasonable evidence. But overall, the more that you understand these risks, the better you're able to identify when they might become a problem and kind of monitor for them as well. And they can quite easily be controlled and mitigate the risk. And usually that amounts to just leading a healthier lifestyle. So exercising and eating healthy, quitting smoking, avoiding, typical health risk factors. And that's usually enough to mitigate the risk such that you don't really have to worry about it otherwise. And yeah, usually testosterone is quite interesting because it's really the key to everything that, kicks off male puberty. It's quite strong, and typically you'll see results very quickly. And very few people may experience serious complications, which may require them to stop taking these treatments, which is, of course, between you and your doctor. Typically, they will take a blood test initially every 3 months or so, and then beyond that, potentially once a year. So they will typically monitor for any signs of increased liver enzymes, which may indicate that you have troubles with your liver function, and any cholesterol level increase, which can typically be controlled with statins, which are medication that reduce cholesterol risk. And so what I'm trying to say is they monitor your blood test results for any risk factors and then, address them as they come up, if they do come up. And that's usually enough to be assured that these are safe. And typically you have to weigh kind of the benefits and risks. A lot of trans people like myself are perfectly willing to accept that there may be risks involved, as there is with any medication or any medical procedure, in order to, address their gender dysphoria or just live the life they want to live. So I would love to see more long-term studies that are rather, kind of come from a more empathetic perspective for trans people, and, just to kind of establish, what are the risk factors so that we can better understand how to give trans people high quality healthcare that they deserve. But that evidence just doesn't quite exist yet, but it will eventually, but just not yet. Next slide, please. So feminizing hormone therapy, similarly to masculinizing hormone therapy, but just kind of the typical, defining female hormone, which is estrogen. You can also, inject it intramuscularly. You can take it in the form of pills, gels, or patches. Subcutaneously, you can have pellets made, but they're not covered by the PBS. So it's like a couple $100, and they make it at a compound pharmacy in like Ballina or something, I don't know, somewhere in middle of nowhere, New South Wales. And also you would typically take a testosterone blocker in order to reduce levels of testosterone if estrogen isn't enough to suppress that. Usually it would be spironolactone or cyproterone acetate, CPA, and very rarely in Australia you would have what are called Gnrh agonists. They're not covered by the PBS. Is similar to, they essentially block the production of hormones, and it's similar to like a puberty blocker, I suppose. And usually I see a lot online about the use of progesterone as well. However, there's no evidence that this is beneficial. There is anecdotal evidence that it does improve mood, libido, and the development of breast tissue, but it's yet to be established in the literature. Typically, when I read about the potential side effects of this therapy, I see a lot about potential risk of deep vein thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the veins of your legs, cardiovascular disease, cholecystitis, which is the blockage of the gallbladder, and also breast cancer. And these risks are modified by the route of administration of estrogen, and whether you're taking estrogen alongside progesterone or just estrogen, which type of testosterone blockers you're taking, if any. So for example, your risk of deep vein thrombosis is negligible if you take estrogen via transdermal patch, whereas if you take oral, like tablet versions of estrogen, then there is an increased risk, but it also depends on the kind of estrogen you're taking. So estradiol is more close to what the form of estrogen you would find naturally in your body, whereas a lot of this data about the potential health side effects of estrogen are based on older studies where they used to use a different form of estrogen that's not as close to bioidentical estrogen. And at one point, I think it was actually derived from the urine of horses. It's called conjugated equine estrogen. And that was associated with increased risk for blood clots and cardiovascular disease. And in hindsight, that was kind of for obvious reasons. Whereas if you take estradiol via a patch, you basically have the same risk of developing a blood clot as the general population, or as like a cisgender woman. Spironolactone is a sodium sparing diuretic, I believe, Oscar, and it makes you pee a lot. It can cause hyperkalemia, which is a really high levels of potassium, which can be dangerous. Might make you crave salty foods. And the alternative, typically, which is the one I'm actually taking, is cyproterone acetate, which tends to be sort of given at much higher doses than necessary. It can cause meningioma, which is a benign tumor of the outer layer of the brain, the dura mater, and also is banned in America because of potential links to hepatotoxicity. However, those risks are typically associated with quite high dosage of CPA. So 50 to 100 milligrams per day. And personally for me, I'm only taking 12.5 milligrams a week, which is far, far smaller than the typical dosage. And yet that's effective enough, though not many doctors realize that, because the standards of care stipulate that you should start on about 25 to 50 milligrams per day. So this is why it's really important, if you're going to take any of these medications, that you try and educate yourself to the best of your ability so that you can make a fully informed decision, because often your doctor may not actually be fully informed themselves. And so again, kind of a, I guess, caveat here is that we don't have enough evidence to talk about the long-term effects of this. And there, like, I mean, as far as we know, there probably are none. And there's no real reason to think that whether you're taking testosterone or estrogen, whichever therapy you're taking, if your hormone levels are within kind of a physiological, like normal, healthy range for a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, whichever way you're going, that there's no reason to think that that would automatically be unhealthy. There's, of course, the option for non-binary people to take hormone replacement therapy as well. You can take lower doses of hormones in order to kind of mitigate your secondary sex characteristics to a degree that you're happy with. However, it's important to realize that it's impossible to, kind of pick and choose what effects you get exactly. If you take testosterone at a low dose, you might not experience a quick degree of masculinization, but eventually you will. If you take estrogen, you can't avoid breast growth. So if you don't want to grow breasts, it doesn't matter what dose of estrogen you take, you don't have to take much, you will develop breasts. So there's no real way to pick and choose what effects you get. So if certain aspects of it give you gender dysphoria and others relieve it, it's important to be aware that it's impossible to kind of pick and choose. Next slide, please. In terms of surgery, there's a lot of different options. None of these are covered by Medicare. Some of the costs are covered in terms of the kind of auxiliary costs around the surgery, but for the surgery itself, you will have to pay out of pocket. That can be tens of thousands of dollars for an individual surgery. So if, it could cost well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars if a trans person wanted multiple of these surgeries. And so they're prohibitively expensive. And even now, they require referral letters from specialist clinicians, and you have to have spent at least a year on hormone replacement therapy before anyone will approve you for these procedures, which can be quite difficult because, of course, there are huge waiting times for these specialists, and not every specialist is going to be willing to work with you. So, for example, I paid about a gap of $200 and something to go see a psychiatrist to talk about gender dysphoria initially, before I started hormones. And she basically told me to go away and find someone else who specializes in trans, who specializes in transgender, I think she said, which was not only grammatically incorrect, but just really fucking weird. Anyway, so you can waste a lot of money going to see these specialist clinicians only to be turned away. And a lot of people, as I said, go overseas, which can be quite dangerous. And I think there's multiple different techniques with different surgeries and different surgeons who have varying levels of experience with no governing body. So it's very important that you do your research, look for reviews, speak to people who have gone with this surgeon if possible, ask about whether or not they're happy with their results, what their overall experience in their care was like. And you really, really, and I urge you to do this, you have to take control of your healthcare in this regard. And that goes for everyone. Especially for women, there's a lot of really bad science and application of that in medicine. For example, they're still teaching surgeons that women essentially can't feel their cervix. And so it's okay to just take a chunk out of a woman's cervix to do a biopsy without anesthetic. So it's really common for women to have a chunk taken out of their cervix without any pain relief. And that's considered okay. So medicine is not has not progressed as much as we would like to think. And while, I would urge you to trust your doctors and medical professionals regarding vaccines, sometimes it's important to inform yourself as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to discuss some topics that are really hot at the moment, really distressing as well. So I'm going to try to be as sensitive as possible when discussing these. My opinion on a lot of these is essentially that a lot of it boils down to transphobia, but at the center of it is the fact that trans people deserve liberation and require more attention in terms of medical literature and also education of the public. but people will use a lot of these topics to kind of weaponize trans identities and just sort of debase trans liberation movements more broadly. So the first of all would be children. Children are, usually at the center of a lot of issues of moral panic, especially now, and especially in Britain. But it kind of has far-reaching impacts on trans healthcare around the world. Most recently, there was the issue with Gnrh Bell, who essentially not lobbied, but had a part to play in the ban on puberty blockers to minors in Britain, which is currently being appealed or overturned, and she's reappealed it. Anyway, essentially, in order to access puberty blockers, you need the consent of the parents. You need to have extensive assessment by a multidisciplinary team of physicians. And you also need to establish that a child is able to understand the implications of that treatment, which can be done. And I want to say that currently, as we understand it, there's a lot of misrepresentation on the rates of desistance, and it's unclear whether this is accurate, but it's almost certain that these rates are extremely small. Some people will quote a rate of about 70% of children desisting from wanting to transition, but this is based on an outdated study that essentially lumped in transgender children with broadly just children who are gender non-conforming, but didn't actually show signs of, or clinically significant signs of gender dysphoria. So any children who dressed in typically masculine or feminine clothes, played with the toys of the opposite sex, that sort of thing, when they weren't necessarily experiencing gender dysphoria. Trans children deserve to be respected and taken care of. They deserve high quality healthcare. And for the grand majority of trans children, that is absolutely the case. There are a lot of amazing clinicians that are doing some great work worldwide. And it's obviously not ethical to kind of withhold medical treatment simply for the fact that someone may regret a treatment. I don't know if that makes sense, but you can't just say, oh, you might regret this treatment, and so we're not going to give it to you. That's not how medicine works. Obviously, this is a very complex topic. It deserves its own presentation, really. But yeah, essentially, these children are being weaponized currently as a way to debase trans healthcare more broadly, especially by TERFs and transphobic politicians. So next slide, please. More recently, with the Olympics, and this was quite distressing to see, there was a lot of hateful shit online about trans people participating in sport. And even people who aren't trans, but just have, higher levels of testosterone than average woman, such as Semenya, who doesn't identify as intersex, is a woman, was raised a woman, and yet was still banned from competing due to her higher levels of testosterone, which were naturally higher than the average woman. Not to say that a woman can't have naturally high testosterone levels. There was a lot of criticism of, any trans person who participates in sports kind of becomes the target of a lot of hate and a lot of criticism, a lot of speculation. And it's really disappointing to see that, it's something that's also being weaponized in the media. Next slide, please. Again, the idea of detransitioning with Gnrh Bell, who is detransitioning from male to female. This is a really hot topic because it's kind of being, again, used to debase the premise of, treating gender dysphoria in the first place. basically saying that, you know, a lot of TERFs and a lot of transphobic politicians will use detransitioners as an example of why no one should ever transition, saying that they're permanently damaged by the treatment that they underwent, which is absolutely not true. There are always ways to, manage, characteristics that they may not be happy with. I think it's really necessary that we embrace people who detransition and not pathologize it in the same way that transitioning was pathologized initially, because I think it's perfectly valid for people to transition, realize that it wasn't right for them, and detransition. There's nothing wrong with that. It's their body, it's their choice. Obviously, we would want to avoid causing unnecessary pain and prevent them from having to undergo that process in the first place. But it's really impossible to determine who is and isn't really trans. That's not really something that a clinician can do. You can't point to something in the brain or in the blood and say this is trans and this is not. And so it makes it very difficult, especially with limited data, to know who is going to detransition and who will not. What are the rates of detransition? It's likely very, very small. But again, we need more research that nobody is willing to do, or that very few people are doing, and we need at least a decade before sufficient results will be available. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about these. I would love to do more presentations on each of these issues individually, but they're basically just the ones that are being targeted in the media right now. I think this is the last slide for me. So any questions from people?
Yeah, I have a question. So at any point of your transition, did you feel, isolated and alone by the Australian medical system? Like, did Medicare or the Australian medical system, they're made, how do I say this? Like, are they clear about, the steps that you need to take?
No, and actually, yeah, I did feel alone. There's no clear steps. Pretty much, if you're a trans person and you want to undergo hormone replacement therapy, you have to seek out that information yourself. It used to be extremely difficult. I love TransHub, which is that website that I mentioned before, but it was only established in 2020. But prior to that, if you wanted that information, you would have to go and find it yourself, and it was often very difficult, or at least time consuming to locate. So you're kind of forced to navigate it yourself without guidance. Yeah.
All right. We have one bit at the end, which we don't really have time for because it's already 3, which was just I think what are the 4 overarching takeaways of what we've tried to portray in this talk, which are as follows. The first is, in my opinion, and I hope people have been convinced, we must destabilize sex as a concept just as much or as more than gender, in order for all queer people, intersex and trans, to be liberated. Biology isn't the ally of TERFs. We should not cede that ground to TERFs. And it's something that we need to defend. The second is transphobes are obviously always going to be wrong about trans people. But it's actually important to know exactly why they're wrong and have the reasons that they're wrong, not only just medical and biological ones, but to be armed with the exact kind of language to talk about why they're wrong. So this is a bit of an obtuse one. The goalposts are always shifting, and it's important to recognize when they are. So in this, we spoke a bit about what the current trend in transphobic rhetoric is, which is, broadly speaking, to define sex as a binary and say that sex is more important. And then also it's been recognized that trans kids, trans people in sport, people who detransition are currently targets of transphobic rhetoric. And I think it's important to keep on top of the issues that transphobes are using to target trans people and to target intersex people, and to recognize when those goalposts of rhetoric are changing. And finally, I think we must be continually critical of the relationship that institutional medicine has with trans people. You know, being close with Tia throughout her transition so far has been me pretty black-pilled about institutional medicine as a whole. I think that, you know, it does a lot of good. And obviously I think I support like regulation, and not in the sense of like regulating who can access, but regulating you know, the systems of access to medicine so that they're safe and trustworthy. But also that we continue to be critical of the fact that no research is happening about trans issues, and critical of the fact that in a lot of cases, access to things like hormones and surgery is quite violent on the behalf of the system. So I think that's all of the talk we had. We have time for some more questions. But if that's it, we can stop there. Cool. Seems like we maybe don't have questions.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I have a question again.
Yeah, sure.
But are there any, you know, countries in the moment who have a sort of accessible trans healthcare system, or is it quite like not there yet?
It really, there's a huge, like, it varies a lot across the world. Obviously, there are countries where it's non-existent and actively hostile. There are, I guess, typical countries like the Netherlands, who I want to say kind of pioneered a lot of this stuff, but obviously not alone. There are researchers worldwide who are involved, but a lot of their protocols were like the basis of protocols around the country that were introduced, I believe. And so I would hazard a guess that they probably have some of the most progressive and accessible systems in terms of trans healthcare. Although, you know, the same can be said of Sweden. Like, I used to think that Sweden was really progressive in this regard because, you know, they pay for a lot of, well, all of gender affirming surgeries, all of your medication, all of your very like expensive specialist appointments. And yet, in order to access those, it requires you to undergo therapy for 3 years at a minimum. I don't know if that's true anymore. I mean to say that it's impossible for me to make a statement on that without talking to someone who actually lived in and experienced that system. It's probably something that I could do more research on.
I also have something to add to this, which is that Iran is an interesting case.
Oh no, Iran.
No, Iran is interesting because Iran subsidizes gender affirmation surgery basically entirely. And it's interesting. I guess the common perception is that, you know, gay people generally enjoy more rights and acceptance and social standing than do trans people in most countries in the world. But it's actually the opposite in Iran, which I have found incredibly fascinating. Don't know if that's totally relevant, but there you go.
I think, I don't want to say for sure, but I think some people have speculated that it's like it's viewed as, if someone's going to be a male, a man who's attracted to men, or a woman who's attracted to women, then somehow transitioning to the opposite sex somehow makes that more acceptable in Iran. And that's why and some people have criticized it as like a form of conversion therapy, like, or even though no gay person in Iran would transition just to be with the people that they love. But I think that's part of the reason it's like a cultural view that it's okay for trans people to transition and that they should be supported in that, because then they fall into like a typical heterosexual relationship at that point. since if a gay man transitions to being a trans woman, then they're a woman who's attracted to men, and that's somehow more acceptable. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but that may be an explanation.
Cool. All right. Enjoy your afternoon, people. I hope this was interesting.
Thanks, guys.